January 31, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the aircraft before him, an intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber bearing the tail number 763-12. This cannot be their standard design. No Air Force would build bombers this way. The fuselage gleamed in the tropical sun, its distinctive cylindrical shape justifying its Allied nickname. Measuring nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, the bomber sat on its tricycle landing gear like a massive cigar resting on the tarmac. The wings, spanning 25 meters tip to tip, showed no battle damage. The engines, 14-cylinder radials producing 1,500 horsepower each, appeared intact. This was not a crashed aircraft salvaged from wreckage. This was a complete operational bomber abandoned by its crew during the American advance. But what had captured McCoy's complete attention, what would revolutionize American understanding of Japanese aviation doctrine, was what he discovered when he climbed inside the wings through the inspection panels. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings of any kind, just thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. Major McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit Southwest Pacific, had examined dozens of crashed Japanese aircraft across the Pacific, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. This bomber, abandoned intact during the American liberation of Clark Field, would expose a design philosophy so alien to Western military thinking that it would take months for analysts to fully comprehend its implications. The mathematics of this discovery would reshape American tactical doctrine and aircraft design for the remainder of the war. Every assumption American pilots held about enemy capabilities, about the price Japanese engineers were willing to pay for performance, about the value imperial forces placed on crew survival, was about to be systematically demolished by the evidence contained within this single, pristine example of Japan's most important bomber. The journey to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. That morning, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M bombers and 26 G3M bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa. Their target was Clark Field itself, the primary American air base in the Philippines. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Arriving at 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. 27 bombers from the initial wave dropped 636 bombs across Clark Field's runways and facilities. Moments later, 0 fighters swept in at treetop level, their machine guns destroying every aircraft that had survived the bombing run. Of 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter freighter was reduced to burning wreckage. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving American pilots, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew to the north. "What struck me was how they came in," he later wrote in his combat report. "Perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne, but the Betty bombers themselves had departed untouched. The few American fighters that managed to get airborne arrived too late, finding only empty sky. The Japanese had demonstrated their bombers' exceptional range, striking from bases 460 miles away, a feat no American bomber could match at that stage of the war. The Betty's first year of combat would prove devastatingly effective. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the Clark Field raid, 26 G4M bombers joined with older G3M bombers in attacking Force Z, a British naval task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser HMS Repulse. The attack began at approximately 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with precision that stunned British observers. The Betty bombers carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms, with a 205-kilogram warhead. The torpedoes were designed specifically for shallow water operations, running at depths that could strike ships even in coastal waters. The torpedo attacks focused on the two capital ships with devastating accuracy. Prince of Wales, a battleship displacing 43,000 tons and representing the newest generation of British naval power, took at least 6 torpedo hits along with damage from level bombers. The underwater explosions ripped massive holes in the ship's hull, flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. The battleship began listing severely. Repulse, a battlecruiser built during World War I but modernized in the 1930s, absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while attempting to evade the attacking aircraft. The ship's anti-aircraft fire claimed several Japanese aircraft, but could not prevent the coordinated torpedo runs from finding their targets. The cumulative damage proved fatal. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours of the attack. Prince of Wales went down at approximately 13:20 hours. Repulse followed at approximately 13:33 hours. 841 British sailors died. The survivors were rescued by escorting destroyers. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power while in the open sea. The G4M Betty bomber had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Across the Pacific Theater through early 1942, American and Allied pilots encountered Betty bombers in every major engagement. The aircraft seemed to operate with impunity, striking targets at ranges that defied conventional understanding. They hit Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles away, demonstrating reach that exceeded any Allied bomber capability. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges, maintaining pressure on Allied positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. They struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across vast ocean expanses. The Betty's operational range gave Japanese forces strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to counter. American fighters based at forward positions lacked the range to intercept Betty bombers departing from distant bases. Allied airfields came under attack from Japanese bases that themselves were beyond Allied striking range. The asymmetry in bomber capability meant that Japanese forces could attack at will while Allied forces struggled to retaliate effectively. This advantage persisted through the first half of the war. Betty bombers participated in virtually every Japanese offensive operation across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They struck targets in the Philippines, Malaya, Netherlands East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They supported naval operations throughout the theater. They performed reconnaissance missions that exceeded any Allied aircraft capability. The Betty became the symbol of Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness. But the advantage depended entirely on limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could strike without interception, when they could approach targets at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, when they could deliver weapons and depart before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized operations during the first half of 1942, when Allied air strength remained limited and dispersed. But by mid-1942, the tactical picture began to change. As American fighter strength increased, as Wildcats gave way to more capable Hellcats and Corsairs, as pilot training improved and tactical doctrine evolved, Betty crews began reporting disturbing losses. The shift became undeniable on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. In the engagement that followed, 18 of the 23 G4M Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died in what would become the single worst G4M loss during the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported the same observation across every engagement. The Betty exploded into flames with minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons. Flying Cigar, One Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo, all references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to bloom into fire from battle damage. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal commanding VF-17 Flying F-4U Corsairs, the Betty's reputation had transformed completely. First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down. Blackburn later reported. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they'd explode. We actively hunted them, recognizing them as among the most vulnerable targets in Pacific skies. The wing access panels revealed fuel cells with no protective measures. Thin aluminum construction. No rubber sealant layer. No protective coating. No fire suppression systems. Multiple Betty bombers examined at Buna showed identical characteristics. This was not battle damage or field modification. This was standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. American bombers by 1942 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had incorporated them from the B-17C model onward. The B-24 Liberator had featured them from the XB-24B prototype. Even fighter aircraft like the P-38 and P-47 featured protected fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks used layered rubber compound that swelled on contact with fuel when punctured by bullets or shell fragments, sealing holes and preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight to aircraft, but dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater with fuel tanks that offered zero protection. The weight saved by eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment was immediately apparent. But the cost in crew lives becoming equally obvious in loss statistics that mounted with every engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most complete technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. Their report, classified secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, detailed specifications that explained both the Betty's extraordinary capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for range and speed. Empty weight of 6,741 kilograms, remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Maximum takeoff weight of 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity of 4,780 liters distributed across 8 unprotected tanks. 4 in each wing, positioned in the wing's center section where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. Top speed of 428 kilometers per hour, or approximately 265 miles per hour. Maximum range of 6,304 kilometers, exceeding 3,700 miles. Service ceiling of 8,500 meters. Crew complement of 7 members, including pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system design was particularly revealing. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 groups of 2, positioned along the wing's longitudinal axis, where the wing joined the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of the wing structure, but it also positioned the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire during combat. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The aluminum construction provided no protection. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant that even small punctures would leak fuel continuously. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. This weight savings translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range. But the cost in vulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports showed that Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. The unprotected tanks created what engineers termed a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. These numbers told the story of design choices made in September 1937 when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the G4M's entire existence. Top speed of 398 kilometers per hour. Cruising altitude of 3,000 meters. Range of 4,722 kilometers unloaded, or 3,700 kilometers carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes.
The requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the range of carrier aircraft. Bombers that could operate from land bases to support naval operations across the entire theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short of these requirements. The G-3 Mel bomber, then in service, had a maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. American bombers like the B-7 had even more limited range in their early variants. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. The Navy's requirements were not arbitrary. They were calculated based on the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict. From Formosa to the Philippines, 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles. From Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. The bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan strategic reach that no other nation possessed. But the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed that enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They assumed that the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every assumption would prove false. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kenichiro Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team after taking over from Joji Hattori. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European aerodynamic engineering principles and manufacturing techniques before returning to Japan. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises that Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled a team of engineers at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities to tackle the design challenges. The team analyzed every aspect of bomber design, calculating weight budgets for every component and system. They studied existing bombers from multiple nations, identifying where weight could be reduced without compromising structural integrity. They experimented with new construction techniques and materials that might offer weight savings. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kilograms. 4,780 liters of fuel meant approximately 3,800 kilograms of fuel at full load. To achieve the required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed minimal weight. Every kilogram added to the empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These two requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy, protection systems were heavy. Armor plating weighing hundreds of kilograms would be required to protect crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through the rubber compound and additional structure required. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving the required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction, no self-sealing compounds, no armor plating around fuel cells, no fire suppression systems beyond basic fire extinguishers, no redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's performance specifications. The decision was not made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew that combat damage to the wings would likely prove catastrophic, but they also knew that the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way with available technology. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy had specified. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber, with Mitsubishi building the aircraft at plants in Nagoya. Initial production models, designated G4M Model 1, began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against Force C demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities in the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed strikes from bases that enemies considered safe. Its speed permitted rapid penetration of target areas. Its payload delivered meaningful damage. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption
The pattern repeated with brutal consistency throughout the campaign. Betty formations would depart from Rabaul, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. August 9th saw additional bombers lost. August 10th brought more losses. By the end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no respite. Betty formations continued striking American positions at Guadalcanal, and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Rabaul. But every mission resulted in losses that could not be replaced. October saw the pattern continue. American fighter strength increased as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit Betty vulnerabilities more effectively. Japanese losses accelerated even as the number of bombers available for missions declined. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men dead. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners had expected losses. All military operations involve casualties, but the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground, no wounded bombers limping home, no damage but survivable aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These sheets were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers, but crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They could not prevent fires from larger caliber rounds or cannon shells. They could not stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M Model 3 introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks with capacity reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original G4M Model 1. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that American forces began using the aircraft in ways that highlighted the dangers Japanese crews faced. On April 18, 1943,
The Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death in an engagement that demonstrated both American signals intelligence capabilities and the aircraft's fatal weaknesses. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The admiral would travel aboard a G-4M bomber with a fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight, though only 16 actually flew the mission after one aircraft blew a tire on takeoff and another suffered drop tank failures. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. Any error in navigation, any deviation in timing, would result in mission failure. The intercept had to occur within a narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft would be vulnerable. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 07:25 hours. They flew at 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was by dead reckoning and timing. The formation arrived at the calculated intercept point with precision that would become legendary in aviation history. At 0934 hours, exactly on schedule and exactly 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, the P-38 spotted Yamamoto's formation, 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanner and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation to engage the bombers while other P-38s held off the Zero fighters. Barber engaged the lead Betty bomber, which carried Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered. The following day, he had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty bomber also crashed, killing all aboard. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners had expected losses. All military operations involved casualties, but the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground, no wounded bombers limping home, no damage but survivable aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30-millimeter rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These sheets were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers, but crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They could not prevent fires from larger caliber rounds or cannon shells. They could not stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G-4M Model 3 introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks with capacity reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original G-4M Model 1. Approximately 60 G-4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that American forces began using the aircraft in ways that highlighted the dangers Japanese crews faced. On April 18, 1943, the Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death in an engagement that demonstrated both American signals intelligence capabilities and the aircraft's fatal weaknesses. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The admiral would travel aboard a G-4M bomber with a fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightnings from the 339 Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight, though only 16 actually flew the mission after one aircraft blew a tire on takeoff and another suffered drop tank failures. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. Any error in navigation, any deviation in timing, would result in mission failure. The intercept had to occur within a narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft would be vulnerable. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 0725 hours. They flew at 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was by dead reckoning in timing. The formation arrived at the calculated intercept point with precision that would become legendary in aviation history. At 0934 hours, exactly on schedule and exactly 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, the P-38 spotted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 60 fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanner and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation to engage the bombers while other P-38s held off the Zero fighters. Barber engaged the lead Betty bomber, which carried Admiral Izuruku Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered. The following day, he had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty bomber also crashed, killing all aboard. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. The Americans are feeding us propaganda through turned agents. Through the tall windows of Abwehr headquarters, Canaris could see the Landwehr Canal, where Rosa Luxemburg's body had been dumped 24 years earlier. Now, as chief of German military intelligence, he held in his trembling hands a report that challenged not just Nazi propaganda, but the entire mathematical foundation of German victory. According to intercepted communications and reports from agents still operating in Mexico City, the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant was producing one 4-engine B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. The B-24 Liberator, 1.5 million individual parts, 450,000 rivets, 30,000 separate components assembled into an 18-ton aircraft, rolling off an assembly line faster than Germany could produce a simple Kübelwagen military vehicle. Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, standing at attention before Canaris's desk, had triple-checked the intelligence. The numbers remained the same. What neither man knew was that this moment would trigger the most devastating intelligence failure in modern warfare, the systematic inability of German intelligence to comprehend, believe, or effectively communicate the true scale of American industrial capacity to the Nazi leadership, dooming the Third Reich through a fatal miscalculation of mathematical inevitability. The collapse of German intelligence regarding American production had begun 2 years earlier. In 1941, Luftwaffe General Karl Kohler had presented Hermann Göring with reports from military attaché General Friedrich von Bittenscher in Washington, stating that American aircraft production was approaching 2,000 planes per month. Göring had laughed, literally laughed, declaring Americans could only build refrigerators and razor blades, not military aircraft. The Americans are bluffing, Göring had told Hitler at the Wolfschanze in December 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Their democracy makes them weak. Their mongrel population makes them inefficient. Their Jews make them corrupt. They cannot possibly produce what they claim. By March 1943, German intelligence networks across the Americas were reporting something that defied every assumption of Nazi racial theory and economic understanding. The reports came from different sources: Mexican industrialists sympathetic to Germany, Spanish diplomats, Swedish businessmen traveling through Detroit, even intercepted letters from American workers to relatives in neutral countries. They all said the same impossible thing. Ford's Willow Run plant alone was producing more heavy bombers than all of Germany's aircraft factories combined. Oberstarzt Nicholas Ritter, head of Abwehr's air intelligence section upon Führer Luft, had spent 3 weeks analyzing the data. A former Lufthansa pilot who had lived in America for 10 years before the war, Ritter understood American industrial capacity better than most German officers. His apartment in Manhattan during the 1920s had overlooked the construction of the Chrysler Building. He had watched Americans erect the world's tallest building in less than 2 years. Herr Admiral Ritter reported to Canaris, "If these numbers are correct, and I believe they are, then Germany has already lost the war. It is now only a question of mathematics and time." The intelligence came through circuitous routes, each more dangerous than the last. Georg Nicholas Ritter, running the Abwehr's primary network in Mexico City, had cultivated sources among American businessmen who traveled freely between Detroit and Mexico's oil fields. These men spoke casually of miracles they witnessed, unaware their dinner conversations were being transcribed by German agents. On February 3, 1943, American oil executive Harold Morrison had attended a reception at the German-Mexican Commerce Association in Mexico City. After several tequilas, Morrison began describing his recent tour of the Willow Run facility, arranged by Ford to showcase to potential investors the company's capability to fulfill government contracts. "Gentlemen," Morrison had said, unaware that Wolfgang Blau, a German agent posing as an Argentine leather merchant, was memorizing every word. "What I saw defies description. The assembly line is over a mile long. The building is so vast that clouds form inside it, and it sometimes rains within the factory. They have 42,000 workers, including thousands of women, Negro women, building the most complex machine ever created." Morrison had pulled out a pencil and began sketching on a napkin. "The bomber has 2 bomb bays, each holding 4,000 pounds of ordnance, 4 engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. They produce them in sections, sub-assemblies Ford calls them, that converge like rivers flowing into the sea. Wing sections arrive from one direction, fuselages from another, tail assemblies from a third. They meet at precise points along the line." Blau had asked, trying to sound casually interested, "But surely such complexity means frequent breakdowns, production delays." Morrison had laughed. "That's what Consolidated Aircraft thought. They mocked Ford, said you can't build planes like cars." But Ford broke the bomber down into 60,000 separate operations. Each worker performs the same task over and over. A woman who yesterday was making breakfast for her children now installs hydraulic lines in the tail section. They train them in days, not months. Perhaps the most detailed intelligence came through Francisco Franco, Spain. Colonel José Angria, Spanish military attaché in Washington, maintained close relations with American aircraft manufacturers while secretly providing intelligence to Germany in exchange for tungsten shipments crucial to Spanish industry. In March 1943, Angria attended a reception at the Argentine embassy where he met Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief and the architect of Willow Run. Sorensen, believing he was speaking to a representative of a neutral nation that might purchase aircraft after the war, spoke freely about the plant's capabilities. Colonel Sorensen had said, unaware that every word would be in Berlin within 2 weeks. "When I first visited Consolidated San Diego plant in 1940, they were building B-24s outdoors in the sunshine, each one different from the last, taking 180,000 man-hours per aircraft. I knew we could do better." Gria had pressed for details, claiming professional interest as a military engineer. Sorensen, proud of his achievement, obliged. "I spent one night in my hotel room in San Diego sketching out the entire production flow. We would build bombers like we build cars, not by having workers swarm over a stationary aircraft, but by moving the aircraft past stationary workers. Each worker would perform specific tasks, repeatedly achieving perfection through repetition." The Spaniard had asked about the workforce challenges of such complexity. "We built an apprentice school that trains 8,000 workers weekly. Women comprise 40% of our workforce. They're actually better at detailed work, smaller hands for tight spaces, more patience for repetitive tasks. We have Negro workers operating sophisticated machinery. We have boys of 16 managing supply logistics. Democracy, Colonel, means utilizing all available human resources." Through Swedish, Argentine, Japanese, and Turkish channels,
German intelligence received consistent reports confirming the production rate. The numbers were staggering. Willow Run alone was producing 650 B-24s monthly at peak, with the entire American B-24 production exceeding 1,400 monthly. Desperate for ground truth, Canaris authorized Operation Pastorius, the insertion of saboteurs into the United States via submarine. George John Dash, leader of one of the two four-man teams, had lived in America for 20 years before returning to Germany in 1939. His secret orders from Canaris was to gather intelligence on aircraft production before conducting any sabotage operations. In the early morning hours of June 13, 1942, Dash's team landed at Amagansett, Long Island, having come ashore from U-202 just after midnight. Within days, tormented by the implications of his mission and what he already knew about American capacity, Dash surrendered to the FBI. During his interrogation, Dash revealed something that stunned his American captives. Canaris himself told me that Berlin doesn't believe your production figures. They think Willow Run is propaganda. He wanted photographs, employee counts, shipping records, proof that would force Göring to accept reality. FBI Special Agent Charles Landman asked incredulously, "They don't believe we're producing a bomber an hour." Dash laughed bitterly. "Agent Landman, I lived here. I've seen your automobile factories. I tried to tell them that if Ford could produce a car every minute before the war, they could certainly produce a bomber every hour during it. They accused me of being defeatist." On April 20, 1943, Hitler's 54th birthday, Canaris personally presented the intelligence to Göring at Korinth Hall, the Reichsmarshal's ostentatious hunting estate north of Berlin. The meeting would become legendary among German intelligence officers for Göring's complete rejection of reality. Canaris had brought photographs, intercepted documents, reports from dozens of sources. He spread them across Göring's massive oak table like a dealer showing cards that would lose the game. "Herr Reichsmarschall," Canaris began carefully, "we have confirmation from 17 independent sources. The Ford Willow Run plant is producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour at peak production." They achieved this rate consistently since January. Göring, weighing over 280 pounds by this point in the war, picked up one of the photographs showing the assembly line stretching into the distance. "Canaris," Göring said with contempt, "do you take me for a fool? These are obviously wooden mock-ups, props for propaganda. The Americans want us to believe they can build aircraft like sausages. This Willow Run plant probably produces 50 bombers monthly at most." Canaris pulled out another document, an intercepted manifest from the Pennsylvania Railroad showing aluminum shipments. "Herr Reichmeister," Göring said, "they're consuming 16 million pounds of aluminum monthly at this one plant. That's more than our entire monthly production." Göring laughed harshly. "Then where do they get this aluminum? From their Negro workers? From their women riveters?" "Canaris, you've been deceived by American propaganda." A week later, Canaris was summoned to the Wolfschanze to brief Hitler personally. The meeting included Generals Jodl and Kittel and Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels. Hitler, studying maps of the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was preparing for Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk, listened impatiently as Canaris presented the intelligence. "Mein Führer," Canaris said, knowing he was risking his life, "if the Americans are producing 1,400 B-24s monthly, plus equal numbers of B-17, plus their fighter aircraft, plus British production, the aerial bombardment of the Reich will soon exceed our defensive capabilities." Hitler's response was characteristic. "Admiral, the Americans are capable of mass production of simple goods, automobiles, refrigerators, but a bomber is not a car. It requires precision, skill, dedication. When it took us 6 years to prepare for war, they claim to have achieved this in 16 months. It's impossible." General Jodl studied Canaris's figures and made a calculation. "Even if we accept 1/4 of these figures as accurate—" "The figures are false," Hitler interrupted. "The Americans entered the war in December 1941. Building this miraculous factory and achieving this production in such time is impossible." Unknown to Nazi leadership, Canaris had obtained film footage of Willow Run in operation through American intelligence contacts in Switzerland. The film, smuggled via Spanish diplomatic pouches, showed 5 minutes of the assembly line in full operation. Canaris and his deputy, Hans Oster,
watched the film in a locked room in Abwehr headquarters. The camera traveled along the entire mile-long assembly line. B-24s in every stage of construction moved past at steady pace. Workers, men, women, black, white, performed tasks with mechanical precision. A clock, visible in several shots, confirmed the timing. "My God," Asta whispered. "It's true." Canaris lit the film with his cigarette lighter, watching it burn. "We cannot show this to them. They would accuse us of creating fake footage or being traitors." In November 1943, German intelligence obtained aerial photographs of Willow Run taken by a Spanish diplomat. Photo analysts spent weeks studying the images. Their conclusions? Parking lots contained approximately 12,000 cars, indicating three-shift operations. Completed B-24s visible at adjacent airfield. 47 aircraft ready for delivery. Assembly line visible through skylights. Aircraft spaced exactly as reported. Rail sightings showed dozens of freight cars delivering materials. Hedman Bernard wrote, "Photographic evidence confirms human intelligence. Production rate appears accurate. Recommend immediate strategic reassessment." Göring, shown the photographs, dismissed them as clever American photographic manipulation, probably using scale models. Dr. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, and the only Nazi leader with genuine understanding of industrial production, secretly obtained the American intelligence. His diary entry for May 15, 1943, discovered after the war, reveals his despair. "If the Willow Run figures are even half accurate, we face not defeat, but annihilation. They produce more aircraft in a month than we do in a year. But I cannot speak this truth. To do so would be my death warrant." Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, head of SD Inland and a trained economist, analyzed American economic data. His report to Himmler in December 1943 was stark. The Ford Motor Company's peacetime production in 1941 was 1.1 million vehicles. They have converted this capacity to bomber production at current rates. By June 1944, the Americans will have produced enough B-24s alone to drop our entire 1940 London bombing tonnage every single day. On Christmas Eve 1943, Canaris received intelligence showing American production projections for 1944. B-24 Liberators, 18,000. B-17 Flying Fortresses, 12,000. B-29 Super Fortresses, 1,000. Fighter aircraft, 40,000. Total? 86,000 aircraft. Hitler's response when presented these figures: "The Americans claim they will produce more aircraft in 1944 than all nations have produced in all history. It's absurd." By February 1944, Canaris was removed from his position, suspected of defeatism and treason. His replacement, Walter Schellenberg, was a Nazi loyalist who wouldn't dare contradict Hitler or Göring. But reality couldn't be ignored forever. On February 20, 1944, Big Week, the American 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, sending over 1,000 heavy bombers against German aircraft factories. In 6 days, they dropped more bomb tonnage than the Luftwaffe had dropped on Britain during the entire Blitz. Luftwaffe fighter pilot Adolf Galland told Göring, "Herr Reichsmarster, I've counted over 800 bombers in a single formation. These planes are real and they're dropping real bombs." On June 6, 1944, over 11,000 Allied aircraft appeared over France. The Luftwaffe could muster fewer than 300 fighters in response. Feldmarschall Hugo Speer sent a desperate message to Berlin. "The enemy's aerial superiority is absolute. Our intelligence was correct. We were deceived not by the Americans, but by ourselves." By April 1944, Willow Run achieved its peak production rate. That month, employees in 2 9-hour shifts, working 6 days a week, produced 453 airplanes in 468 hours, a production rate equal to one finished B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. The plant employed 42,331 workers, including 11,000 women, 26% of workforce, 3,800 African Americans, 9% of workforce, 1,200 disabled workers, 3% of workforce. This demographic breakdown would have shattered Nazi racial ideology completely. The inferior races and weaker sects were outproducing the German master race by orders of magnitude. After the war, surviving German intelligence officers revealed the full scope of the failure. Walter Schellenberg testified at Nuremberg. "We knew the truth about American production by early 1943. Every professional intelligence officer understood the numbers were accurate. But to report this truth was to risk execution for defeatism." Hans Bernd Gisevius wrote in his memoirs, "The tragedy was not that we lacked intelligence about American production. We were drowning in it. The tragedy was that our leadership refused to believe it because it contradicted their racial ideology." The German intelligence officers who tried to report the truth paid a heavy price. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, executed April 9, 1945, at Flossenburg concentration camp. Hans Oster, executed April 9, 1945, at Flossenburg concentration camp. Alexis von Rohen, executed October 1944 for involvement in July 20th plot. Hans Bernd Gisevius escaped to Switzerland, survived the war. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed what German intelligence had reported. Willow Run produced 8,685 B-24s between 1942 and 1945. Peak production was 650 aircraft monthly. The hourly rate was sustained for months. Total cost per aircraft dropped from $238,000 to $137,000. Albert Speer, in post-war The Interrogation, was asked why Germany didn't believe the intelligence about American production. To accept that Ford could produce a bomber every hour was to accept that our entire worldview was wrong, that democracy wasn't weak but strong, that racial mixing didn't create weakness but strength, that women could do men's work. It would mean accepting that we had started a war we could never win. Who would tell Hitler that? Rose Willie Monroe, the real-life inspiration for Rosie the Riveter, operated a rivet gun on the B-24 production line. She and thousands of women like her had never worked in industry before Pearl Harbor. "We knew we were building something important," Monroe said in a 1984 interview. "Every rivet we drove was going to help end the war. We worked double shifts, sometimes sleeping in the parking lot between shifts. We had brothers, husbands, sweethearts flying these planes." The failure to believe intelligence about Willow Run had catastrophic consequences. Fighter production. Germany continued producing bombers until late 1944. Resource allocation. Resources wasted on wonder weapons instead of practical defenses. Strategic planning. Operations planned for facing hundreds of bombers, not thousands. Diplomatic failures. Peace overtures delayed due to not understanding certain defeat. German economists analyzing captured documents realized the true scale. Willow Run cost $200 million. German entire aircraft industry investment, 1933-1945, $400 million equivalent. Willow Run floor space, 3.5 million square feet. All German aircraft factories combined, 8 million square feet. Willow Run electrical consumption, 2.5